The chandeliers dripped with light, scattering diamonds across the polished marble floor. Music swelled from hidden speakers, soft and refined as waiters carried silver trays through the glittering crowd. Every guest was dressed in silk and gold, their laughter echoing under the vaulted ceilings. In the midst of it all, moving with quiet precision, was Maya. She wore the uniform of the staff, black dress, white apron, her hair pulled neatly back. She smiled politely when spoken to, but her eyes carried the exhaustion of someone working 2 jobs, surviving 1 shift at a time. She kept her head down, careful not to brush too close to the gowns or the tuxedos. Each step was measured, practiced. Yet even in silence, she carried herself with a quiet grace that some noticed, though they didn't quite know why. Among them was Charles Ashford, billionaire, host of the night, a man whose name alone bent rooms into silence. He lounged in his chair at the center of the hall, glass of wine in hand, watching everything as if it belonged to him. When Maya passed, balancing a tray of champagne flutes, his eyes narrowed. A smirk lifted his lips. He glanced toward the gleaming grand piano in the corner of the hall, untouched, waiting for the professional hired to play later. He leaned back, voice sharp enough to cut through the music. "You there?" he called, pointing his glass at her. "Yes, you, the waitress. Why don't you entertain us?" The room stilled. Forks clinked against plates, then stopped. Maya froze, tray steady in her hands, though her chest tightened. She blinked, unsure he meant her. But Charles laughed, waving his glass toward the piano. "Come now. Don't be shy. Surely you can play something. A little Chopin perhaps, or is that too cultured for the likes of you?" Gasps broke through the crowd, soft but sharp. Some guests shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. Others smiled awkwardly, waiting to see her crumble. The pianist, standing near the bar, looked away uncertain. Maya's throat tightened. Heat rose to her cheeks. She wasn't dressed for this, wasn't here for this. She came to work, not to be mocked. But Charles leaned forward, pressing the humiliation deeper. "What's wrong? Afraid? Or is the piano too big for a girl who only knows trays and tables?" The laughter that followed was brittle. Not everyone joined in, but enough to sting. Maya's fingers gripped the tray, steady but trembling at the edges. For a moment she considered walking away. For a moment she thought of her mother's words. "Dignity doesn't bow." Silence grew heavy. Phones slipped discreetly from purses, from pockets. Tiny red lights blinked on, recording. The stage was set, but not the way Charles imagined. Every eye fixed on Maya, waiting to see what she would do. The trap was sprung, and the room held its breath, unaware that the first note had already been written in her heart. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, lips curled into an easy grin. He waved dismissively, as if this whole moment were nothing more than a parlor trick for his own amusement. "Go on then," he chuckled to the men seated beside him. "Let's see what she's got. This should be good." Laughter followed, not loud, not kind, just sharp enough to cut. Maya's feet felt heavy against the polished floor. Her fingers twitched against the tray she still carried. Around the room, reactions broke into fragments. Some guests smirked, eager for the spectacle. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes darting between her and Charles, unwilling to challenge the balance of power. A woman near the back pressed her lips into a thin line, then looked away. The pianist hired for the evening, an older man in a crisp black suit, stood frozen near the bar, his hands clenched at his sides. He knew what was happening, but his silence spoke louder than any protest. The hall was turning into a stage, and Maya was the unwilling performer. Her heart thudded against her ribs. She could feel the weight of every gaze, waiting for her to stumble, to fail, to confirm the role Charles had chosen for her. The moment wasn't an invitation, it was a trap. An ugly performance of power meant to remind everyone who held the spotlight and who carried the trays. Then came the click of a phone camera. Another. Quiet red lights blinked beneath tables, screens angled just enough to capture her humiliation. What was once private mockery was now becoming public record. Maya's breath caught. She looked at Charles, lounging with a smile that wasn't a smile at all. She looked at the piano, glossy and perfect in the corner, keys gleaming under the lights. Her reflection stared back at her, small and fragile, yet steady. She looked back at Charles again, his confidence thick as smoke. The tray in her hands no longer trembled. She bent slightly, placed it on a side table with deliberate calm. Her steps toward the piano carried no rush, no panic. Gasps broke from the crowd. Small surprised. She pulled out the bench, the wood scraping softly against the marble floor. Charles chuckled, already savoring what he thought would be her collapse. But Maya didn't falter. Her hands hovered just above the keys, fingers curled slightly, as though she had sat there 1,000 times before. Her shoulders squared, her back straightened, the room leaned closer, breath held, waiting for the spectacle of failure. What Charles hadn't understood was that the joke was never hers to carry. As Maya lowered herself onto the bench with quiet resolve, the trap shifted. The power no longer rested in his mocking tone, but in the silence she claimed for herself. The joke had gone too far, and for the first time all night, it wasn't funny anymore. The bench creaked softly as Maya lowered herself onto it. The room leaned forward, a collective breath tightening in the air. Charles sat smug, expecting chaos, expecting fumbling fingers and broken sound. His grin widened as she placed her hands above the keys, convinced she would expose herself. But when her fingers pressed down, the very first note filled the hall with something no one expected. It wasn't timid, wasn't clumsy. It was low, resonant, commanding. A sound that hung in the air like a warning bell. Conversations died mid-whisper. Glasses stilled halfway to lips. Even the chandeliers seemed to pause in their shimmer. Maya did not look up. Her eyes stayed fixed on the keys, steady and certain, as though she'd known this piano her whole life. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing slowed. The notes unfolded, one after another, weaving together into a melody that grew larger than the room itself. Gasps broke across the crowd. A man at the front mouthed, "My God!" The pianist at the bar stepped forward, disbelief tightening his brow. This wasn't a waitress fumbling in humiliation. This was mastery. Charles leaned back, irritation tugging at his jaw. The amusement drained from his face. His smirk faltered as Maya's hands moved faster, each note deliberate, layered with strength. She played not to entertain, not to beg for applause, but to speak through music what words could not hold. Phones rose higher now, no longer hidden under tables but proudly lifted into the air. Screens glowed, capturing every movement of her fingers, every shift in her expression. Flashbulbs blinked. A ripple of awe spread like a wave through the hall. Maya's face remained calm, almost defiant. The humiliation Charles had staged had dissolved into reverence. The melody swelled, climbing higher, pulling hearts into its rhythm. By the time she struck the crescendo, the sound was cathedral-like, echoing, holy, undeniable. No one laughed now. No one smirked. They sat as though under spell, breathing only when she allowed. And then, with a final sweep of her fingers, the note rang out into silence. The last note lingered, trembling in the chandeliers, drifting like smoke into every corner of the hall. For a long moment, no one moved. It was as if time itself had bent around the sound and refused to let go. Maya sat with her hands resting gently on the keys. She did not bow, did not smile. She simply breathed, calm and unshaken. The silence was not empty. It was full, heavy, demanding. Charles shifted in his chair. His fingers drummed against the stem of his glass. He tried to summon his smirk again, but it came out weak, crooked. The spotlight that once obeyed him had turned. Now he was the one exposed. And then it came applause. Not the soft, polite clapping reserved for background music. It was explosive, uncontainable. Guests shot to their feet, clapping hard, cheering louder with each passing second. Someone whistled, someone shouted, "Bravo!" The sound filled the hall like thunder. Maya bowed her head once, quietly, and stood from the bench. She did not soak in the applause. She simply stepped back, her posture straight, her face composed. She left the music behind her, as if it had never belonged to her alone. Whispers rippled as she walked away. Who is she? She's not just a waitress. The questions burned, desperate for answers. Charles forced a laugh. Well played, he muttered, his voice hollow. A few men around him chuckled nervously, but no one joined in. The laughter sounded wrong now, brittle, like glass ready to break. The applause continued, echoing longer than any song played that night. People turned not to Charles but to Maya, their eyes following her as though she carried something untouchable. For the first time in his empire of influence, Charles Ashford was not the story. He had tried to stage humiliation. Instead, he had been silenced. Even after Maya slipped back into her role balancing trays once more, the whispers did not fade. They grew louder, weaving from table to table like wildfire. "She's not just a waitress," the woman murmured, clutching her pearls. "Did you see her hands? Like she's trained her whole life," another said. "Why haven't we heard of her before?" Several guests pulled out their phones, checking the videos they had recorded. Fingers tapped quickly, uploading, sharing, sending the moment to the world beyond those walls. Within minutes, hashtags appeared on the first note. Waitress no more. The digital tide began to rise. Maya moved quietly, placing glasses on tables, collecting plates. But her co-workers' eyes followed her with something more than pride. They knew what had happened was bigger than a song. It was dignity turned into power. At the head table, Charles fumed. His jaw clenched, his knuckles whitening around his wine glass. Every laugh from earlier had curdled into memory, replaying against the roar of applause that had not been his. The audience was no longer his to control. He glanced at the glowing screens, realizing too late that the moment had already escaped the room. What he thought would vanish after dessert was now alive online. Uncontainable. Guests leaned together, voices hushed but urgent. "She'll go viral. You'll see. By morning everyone will know her name." Charles tried to interject, raising his glass. "Now let's not overreact. It was a charming display, nothing more." But his words landed flat, ignored. Eyes rolled. The power had shifted, subtle but undeniable. In the kitchen, Maya set down her tray. Her hands trembled now, not from fear, but from the release of holding steady under fire. A coworker touched her shoulder, whispering, "You showed him. You showed all of them." Outside the hall, a guest whispered into her phone, "You won't believe what just happened. Check your feed." The story was no longer confined to four walls. It was growing, multiplying, spilling into 1,000 homes. And as Charles sat alone in his gilded chair, he could feel the crowd slipping away, no longer orbiting his wealth but the quiet dignity of a waitress, who had silenced him with a single note. By the time Maya hung her apron and stepped out into the cool night air, the world had already begun to change. She didn't know it yet. Her shift had ended like any other, her feet aching, her hands raw from dishes and trays. But as she walked home through quiet streets, the glow of 1,000 phones lit up with her image. The video spread like fire in dry grass. Within hours, millions had watched the billionaire's sneer dissolve into silence as Maya's music filled the room. The clip was short, but it told a story everyone understood. The laughter, the humiliation, and then the first note that flipped the night upside down. Some compared her to historical icons who had turned humiliation into resistance. Others said she embodied every worker treated like furniture until dignity demanded attention. And then the hashtags began. The first note, "Waitress no more." Voices multiplied, stories echoed, the digital tide pulling strangers together. Journalists scrambled to find her name. Music teachers claimed they recognized her skill. Former classmates spoke of a girl who practiced after school in empty auditoriums. Alone, long after others went home. For Maya, the night ended in silence. She turned the key to her apartment, set her shoes by the door, and kissed her sleeping brother on the forehead. She had no idea the internet had already chosen her, already lifted her from anonymity into a symbol of quiet defiance. But while the world celebrated her, others looked closer, not at her, but at the man who tried to break her. And the storm was only beginning. Attention turned quickly, almost ruthlessly, toward Charles Ashford. His name had always carried weight. Billionaire, philanthropist, patron of the arts. But now, framed against Maya's brilliance, his smirk looked cruel, his power brittle. Investigative threads began pulling at his past. What had been whispered in offices and filed in courtrooms resurfaced in daylight. Old lawsuits against his company's claims of discrimination swept quietly under carpets. Former employees stepped forward, speaking of sudden firings after raising concerns, of careers crushed under his signature. Financial reporters unearthed stories of charity galas that masked tax loopholes. Philanthropy, they wrote, that gave less than it claimed. Anonymous sources whispered of staff humiliated behind closed doors, of jokes that cut sharp like knives. The humiliation he tried to engineer for Maya had become his own. The video wasn't just entertainment anymore, it was evidence. A mirror reflecting something the world had ignored too long. Headlines spread like wildfire. Billionaire tries to mock Waitress, gets mocked by world. The first note that shook an empire. Charles's PR team scrambled. They released statements calling the moment a misunderstanding, urging the public not to overinterpret lighthearted banter. But every denial fueled the outrage. Screenshots leaked of panicked emails, of orders to control the narrative. Instead of control, he found chaos. Protests formed outside his corporate offices. Investors demanded answers. Online petitions called for boycotts of his businesses. His name, once gilded, now carried the sour taste of arrogance. And through it all, the clip of Maya at the piano kept playing. The contrast too sharp to ignore. Her grace against his sneer. Her calm against his cruelty. The man who thought himself untouchable was suddenly exposed, not by rivals or politicians, but by the dignity of a young woman he had dismissed. The next morning, reporters lined Maya's street. Microphones waited like traps, cameras angled toward her door. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains as vans filled the block. She woke to knocking, to voices calling her name. Interview offers poured in, emails stacked with promises, talk shows, sponsorships, magazine covers. Her phone buzzed non-stop, strangers begging to tell her story. But Maya refused them all. She walked past the cameras with her head high, silent, steady. The microphones stretched toward her, but she gave them nothing. Her mother's voice guided her. Don't let them use you. They'll twist it. Protect yourself. Maya nodded quietly, choosing silence as her shield. Commentators filled the gaps. Some speculated she was a prodigy fallen into poverty. Others guessed she had turned down fame before. The less she spoke, the more the world leaned closer. At the restaurant, her co-workers greeted her with hugs and whispers of pride. Customers lined the sidewalk. Some cheering, some simply watching her carry plates again, as though nothing had changed. But everything had. And Charles? He seethed. Her silence made her untouchable. Every attempt to paint her as ungrateful only magnified her dignity. His empire of words collapsed against her refusal to speak. The internet had already crowned her something more than herself, the symbol of quiet defiance, the calm that breaks arrogance. Maya had not asked for this. But now, the world waited to see what she would choose next. The pressure broke wider when a prestigious conservatory stepped forward. Their letter, written in gold seal and careful words, went public. We are honored to offer Maya Johnson a full scholarship, it read. Her talent belongs on the world stage. Crowds gathered outside the restaurant, holding signs of encouragement. Strangers shouted her name as she walked through the door for her shift. Her co-workers stood taller, proud that one of their own had become something larger than gossip. Inside, cameras flashed through the windows. Customers clapped as she passed, though she bowed her head, uneasy with the attention. The scholarship was freedom, a chance to study without debt, to play without mockery. But freedom came with cost. Maya's family relied on her wages, her younger brother's school fees, her mother's medicine, the rent that threatened to rise. All of it tied her to the very job she was being urged to leave. At night she sat by the kitchen table, the letter spread open before her. Her brother leaned close, eyes shining. You have to go, he whispered. Her mother touched her hand. Don't lose yourself in their promises. Maya's chest ached. She wanted to fly, but her roots held tight. Accepting meant leaving behind the world she carried, breaking the balance she had fought so hard to maintain. The internet buzzed with speculation. Will she take it? She deserves it. She can't walk away from this chance. The choice felt impossible, liberating and terrifying in equal measure. Charles Ashford wasn't finished. Not yet. Cornered by headlines, battered by public outrage. He tried to flip the story. He appeared in a carefully lit video, seated in front of a fireplace, voice softened by rehearsal. It was never my intention to cause harm, he began. It was a light-hearted moment, misunderstood in the heat of the evening. Maya was grateful for the opportunity to share her gift. The script was polished, the tone measured, but the world had already seen too much. The internet exploded. Hashtags multiplied. Silence is priced. Dignity not for sale. His apology video, meant to soften, became fuel for fire. Memes mocked his backdrop. His words dissected frame by frame. Protesters gathered outside his offices with pianos painted on signs. Musicians uploaded their own videos of the first note, dedicating them to Maya. The scandal was no longer just his cruelty, it was the system that allowed such cruelty to hide behind wealth. Charles raged behind closed doors, demanding new strategies. But every attempt to rewrite the story collapsed. His empire was built on performance. Now the performance had betrayed him. What was once an embarrassing clip had grown into a movement, and Maya, in her silence, had become its unshakable center. The world waited for her voice, but Maya stayed silent longer than anyone expected. Reporters grew restless, tabloids invented stories, and speculation filled every corner of the internet. And then, without warning, she agreed, not to a glossy magazine, not to a primetime network, but to a small community paper known for listening when no one else would. The interview was recorded in a modest office, shelves stacked with old issues, a single recorder placed on the table. Maya sat with her hands folded in her lap, posture straight but unpretentious. The journalist asked gently, "Why now?" She spoke softly, but each word carried weight. "I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was protecting my dignity." The quote spread instantly, reprinted, tweeted, painted across protest signs. For the first time, the world heard not just her music, but her reasoning. She told them about her father, a man who once dreamed of being a pianist but set it aside to provide for his family. She described the evenings she spent at an old church piano after shifts, practicing alone while the rest of the world slept. She spoke of music not as ambition, but as refuge, a language she never expected anyone to hear. The journalist listened, hardly interrupting. Maya's words painted her humanity, her exhaustion, her hope, her quiet resilience. She didn't try to be larger than life. She was just herself, and that was enough. When the interview was published online, it reached far beyond the paper's usual readership. Millions tuned in, captivated by her calm, her refusal to be twisted into something she wasn't. Commenters wrote, "She speaks like she plays, steady, powerful, without needing to shout." Charles had tried to define her. The world had speculated about her. But now, Maya defined herself. And with a few quiet words, the movement deepened. The interview lit a fuse that spread beyond music, beyond one night's humiliation. Protests formed outside Charles Ashford's offices, crowds carrying pianos sketched on cardboard, chanting for accountability. But the demands were bigger than him now. They wanted change for every worker dismissed, every dignity denied. Musicians across the country uploaded videos under the hashtag #WayItForward. Students dragged keyboards into subway stations, playing defiant melodies while commuters filmed. Workers recorded themselves tapping rhythms on tables, calling it the music of labor. The message was clear. Dignity was a song too many had been denied. Maya became a reluctant icon. Her face appeared on murals. Her quote, "I was protecting my dignity," painted on banners. She hadn't asked for this stage, but it had found her. In cities far from hers, strangers spoke her name with reverence. If she can stand up with one note, so can we. Charles's office windows were plastered with signs. Respect is not optional. Money cannot mute dignity. Security tried to clear the crowds, but the chants only grew louder. The movement spread online and offline, a river that refused to be dammed. And at its center stood Maya. Not loud, not fiery, but steady. Her calm had become contagious. Her silence had become mute. In gleaming boardrooms high above the city, Charles's empire began to crack. Investors gathered in hushed meetings, their polished shoes clicking nervously against marble floors. Slides projected graphs that dropped sharply, red lines plunging like freefall. Sponsors pulled out of partnerships. Charities quietly returned his checks. Every brand tied to his name now feared contamination. Executives whispered about reputational risk, about protecting themselves from the storm. Behind closed doors, Charles slammed fists against tables. "It's a fad. It will pass," he barked. But the eyes around him no longer carried loyalty. They carried calculation. His power, once unshakable, now looked like a liability. Legal inquiries began circling. Old cases resurfaced, and new ones opened. Regulators sniffed opportunity. Journalists dug deeper into the vaults of his empire. What started as a joke at a dinner had spiraled into a reckoning at the highest levels of wealth and power. For once his money could not shield him. Not from public outrage, Not from legal scrutiny, not from the very people he had once commanded. The storm he created had broken into his boardroom, and there was no roof strong enough to keep it out. While the world roared outside, Maya's home remained small, steady, and real. She sat at the kitchen table helping her younger brother with his math homework. He grinned, pencil in hand. "You're on TV," he said proudly, pointing at a tablet glowing with her face. She laughed softly. "Finish your equation first." For a moment, the noise of protests and headlines vanished. She was simply a sister, a daughter, a woman balancing the same bills stacked neatly on the counter. Rent still loomed. Medicine still cost. Viral fame did not erase ordinary struggle. Her mother stirred a pot on the stove, glancing at Maya with a mixture of pride and worry. "They see you now," she said quietly. "But don't forget, we still live here. We still have to eat tomorrow." Maya nodded. The applause, the hashtags, the invitations, all of it felt distant when she folded laundry, when she counted coins for groceries. She understood what the world forgot. Dignity didn't end with recognition. It lived in the grind of everyday survival. Her brother leaned against her arm. "You showed them," he whispered. "You showed everybody." Maya smiled, grounding herself in the truth. Fame was fleeting. Family was permanent. And though the world painted her as a symbol, at this table she was simply Maya. The invitation arrived with ceremony. Sealed and formal. A public concert dedicated to dignity and equality, with Maya as its centerpiece. At first, she hesitated. She feared becoming a token, a performance used to soothe guilt rather than inspire change. But something in her shifted. This time, the piano would not be a weapon forced upon her. It would be her choice. The night of the concert, the hall filled with thousands. People of every class, every color, every age sat side by side. Protest signs were transformed into banners of celebration. Cameras flashed, but the mood was reverent, expectant. Maya stepped onto the stage, not in uniform but in a simple dress her mother had sewn years before. She walked with calm certainty, her presence commanding more than any spotlight could. As she sat at the piano, silence spread like a tide. No mockery, no arrogance, no trap, only choice. Her fingers touched the keys and the first note rose, not forced but freely given. The music was strong, steady, filled with sorrow and triumph. Each chord carried weight, every crescendo lifting hearts higher. When the final note faded, the crowd erupted, rising to its feet in thunderous applause. But this time, the applause wasn't just for her talent. It was for the dignity she had reclaimed, the symbol she had become. Maya stood, bowed her head once, and let the sound wash over her. She had played before but never like this. Never on her own terms. It began quietly, with a folder slipped into the hands of an investigative journalist. Inside were documents, memos, financial statements, contracts that painted a portrait of rot beneath Charles Ashford's empire. A whistleblower long silenced had decided enough was enough. The documents revealed years of corruption, tax evasion hidden behind charitable fronts, employees dismissed for speaking out about abuse, properties bought through shell companies, patterns of intimidation threaded through his legacy of wealth. Each page told a story not of brilliance but of exploitation. News outlets pounced. Headlines screamed across screens. Ashford exposed. Billionaire's empire built on lies. Stock prices plunged overnight, red numbers tumbling down financial tickers. Investors scrambled to distance themselves, their loyalty evaporating with every broadcast. Investigations expanded. Federal inquiries circling his offices like vultures. Subpoenas piled on desks. Once loyal allies cut ties in public statements, claiming ignorance though many had benefited from his power. The world that had once bent to his wealth now recoiled from it. Cameras captured the image that defined his downfall. Charles Ashford leaving his headquarters, suit wrinkled, face pale, eyes sunk. The man who had sneered at Maya with effortless arrogance now looked diminished, broken under the weight of dignity he could not destroy. Crowds gathered outside his offices, chanting not insults but words that had become larger than him. Respect is not optional. His name, once gilded, now carried the taste of disgrace. Commentators drew the arc clearly. The joke he tried to play at a piano bench had become the thread that unraveled decades of untouchable wealth. He had mocked dignity, and dignity had dismantled him. And somewhere across the city, Maya sat quietly at her kitchen table, folding laundry, listening as the television described his collapse. She did not celebrate, did not gloat. She simply nodded once, understanding that power had shifted, not because she had sought it, but because truth had demanded it. The outrage did not fade. It grew sharper, more organized, louder in halls of power. Lawmakers, pressed by petitions and protests, began drafting what they called the Dignity in Service Act. The bill promised protections for service workers, measures to prevent harassment, to hold abusers accountable, to ensure no one could use wealth as a shield against basic respect. Employers would be required to train staff and guests alike in codes of conduct. Violations would face real penalties, not quiet settlements. News channels aired debates, cameras fixed on senators who spoke of dignity not as charity but as law. Workers testified before committees, telling stories of humiliation, of exploitation, of nights that ended in tears behind closed kitchen doors. Maya's video was played again and again as evidence of what one moment could reveal. At home, Maya sat with her family, the television glowing across their faces. Her younger brother asked, "They're making a law because of you?" She smiled faintly, shaking her head. "Because of us. Because it was never just me." Her mother wiped her eyes as lawmakers spoke of change. Commentators called it historic, the first major step toward rebalancing the power between wealth and labor in decades. On signing day, crowds filled the steps of the Capitol. Protesters held banners painted with pianos, with hashtags that had become battle cries. The act passed with overwhelming support, not just because it was right, but because millions demanded it. Maya did not stand at the podium. She watched from her living room, folding her arms as the president signed the bill into law. Tears welled in her eyes, not from pride alone but from the knowledge that humiliation had been transformed into reform. What had begun as cruelty in a glittering hall had become law written into the fabric of a nation. Weeks later, the restaurant where everything began unveiled something new. Just inside the front doors, mounted against polished wood, hung a plaque. It read, "This space belongs to dignity, equality, and respect." Beneath the inscription was a recounting of Maya's story. How a waitress forced to play became a symbol of quiet defiance. How her music silenced cruelty and inspired reform. It was not framed as shame for the restaurant but as testimony. A reminder that silence enables injustice, but dignity remakes the world. Guests paused to read it as they entered, their eyes lingering on the words. Some bowed their heads. Others took photos, sending them across social media. Children asked their parents, "Who was she?" and were told a story of strength. For the staff, the plaque was more than decoration. It was protection, a shield against arrogance, a reminder that their work carried value, that respect was not optional. New training sessions reinforced it. Management shifted its tone. Guests treated them differently, reminded with every glance at the plaque that the rules had changed. Maya herself returned one quiet evening, not for work, but as a guest. She stood before the plaque, her reflection mirrored in its polished surface. She traced the words with her eyes, breathing in the weight of it. A server passed by and whispered, "Because of you it feels different here." Maya smiled gently. "Because of us," she corrected. The piano still stood in the corner, gleaming beneath soft lights. No one dared mock it now. It had become something more than an instrument. It was memory, proof of what dignity could sound like, when struck with courage. The restaurant, once a stage for arrogance, had become a place of testimony. Every guest who walked through its doors was reminded, wealth may buy walls and chandeliers, but it cannot purchase respect. And for all who read the plaque, Maya's story lived on, not as a viral clip, not as a fleeting scandal, but as a permanent engraving in the fabric of memory. The restaurant looked different now. The same chandeliers sparkled above. The same polished marble reflected soft light. Yet the air carried something new. Respect. Memory. The weight of what had happened here lingered in every corner. Maya entered not in uniform this time, but as a guest. She wore a simple dress, her shoulders relaxed, her face calm. People noticed immediately. Conversations paused, whispers passed from table to table. Some smiled, some lowered their eyes in quiet acknowledgement. The plaque near the entrance bore her story etched in metal, impossible to ignore. Guests who had walked past without a glance before now stopped to read, their faces softening as they absorbed the words. But it wasn't the plaque that caught Maya's attention. It was the piano. There it stood, gleaming in the corner, polished to perfection. The same bench, the same keys, but now it was more than an instrument. It was a symbol, almost sacred, carrying the echo of the night everything changed. She walked toward it slowly, each step drawing the room into silence. Servers paused mid-motion. Guests turned in their chairs, holding their breath as though history might repeat itself. When she reached the piano, Maya stopped. Her reflection shimmered faintly on its black surface. Her hand hovered above the keys but did not touch. She remembered the first note, the gasp of the crowd, the sound that turned humiliation into defiance. But tonight, she did not sit. She did not play. She simply walked past. The silence that followed was louder than any applause. It wasn't disappointment, it was reverence. The power was no longer in the music itself, but in her choice. By walking past, she showed that dignity was not bound to performance. It lived in presence, in refusal, in freedom. A man near the back whispered, "She doesn't need to prove anything." His words rippled through the room like a second silence, reminding everyone why the piano stood untouchable now. Maya moved toward a table where her family waited, their faces glowing with pride. Her brother grinned, eyes bright. "They all thought you'd play," he whispered. She smiled gently. "Not tonight." The servers who once worked beside her exchanged quiet glances, their shoulders straightening with a pride they could not name. For them, her walk past the piano was more than a choice. It was liberation. The restaurant, once a place where she carried trays under the weight of dismissal, had become a stage for her quiet victory. And she had conquered it not with sound, but with silence. That night, the piano remained untouched. Yet its presence grew louder, carrying the reminder that dignity is not always in the notes we play, but in the choices we refuse to make. The story did not end with Maya's silence in that restaurant. It lived on, far beyond marble floors and polished keys. Children began taking piano lessons, their parents telling them about the woman who turned humiliation into triumph with a single note. Teachers wrote her name into lesson plans, not as celebrity but as an example of dignity lived through music. Workers across industries invoked her story. Restaurant staff demanded protections. Hotel employees spoke up. Factory workers told managers, "We will not be silenced." And when asked why, they pointed to Maya's video. To the night dignity played louder than wealth. Policies shifted. Companies rewrote training manuals. Schools introduced courses on workplace respect. Lawmakers cited her story during debates, reminding their colleagues that the balance between power and labor was not theoretical. It was human. She accepted none of it as fame. She carried it instead as responsibility. The music she played that night was no longer just hers. It belonged to anyone who had been silenced, mocked, or dismissed. It was proof that dignity could not be stolen when guarded by courage. One afternoon, as she walked home, she paused to watch a group of children gathered around a small keyboard on the sidewalk. Their fingers stumbled through scales, their laughter light. One girl, no older than 10, pressed a key with deliberate force. The note rang out strong, and the others clapped as if it were a masterpiece. Maya smiled. The legacy of the first note had already spread farther than she could measure. And so, the story closed not on her fame, but on her quiet power. She had not sought the stage, yet it found her. She had not asked for reform, yet it came. Her presence, her refusal to surrender dignity, had shifted not only a moment, not only a man, but an entire culture. As she continued down the street, the sun low in the sky, strangers nodded, children waved, cars slowed, drivers tipping hats in acknowledgement. It wasn't celebrity, it was recognition. The kind that lingers not in headlines but in hearts. The world remembered not just her music, but the dignity she refused to surrender. And in that refusal, she had given something greater than applause. She had given a reminder that even in silence, dignity sings.